Here are more lies Netflix told on Tiger King. We're going to get right into Dawn Lewis. When Carol first met Dawn, she had a fight with her husband. She met him when he was her boss at one of her first jobs. Apparently, throwing a potato during a fight with him wasn't the right move at all, so Carol just took off barefoot out of the house. Carol was walking around and guys and cars started to follow her around. She was attracting the wrong type of attention, and one guy stopped his car. He was middle-aged and wasn't well-dressed at all, but he had on a big smile, according to Carol, and he stopped and told Carol to get in his car. She said, "No." How weird were dudes back then? Seriously. But hey, at least he drove off, right? But wait, he actually drove back around, this time with a revolver. Just why? Well, his reasoning was this. He propositioned Carol to get in the car again, and he told her that she could hold the revolver on him so she knew she would be safe in the car. If that's not a reason to not get in a car with a stranger, we don't know what is. But Carol, fed up with her husband and wanting an adventure, got in. The man told her that his name was Bob Martin. He too had been fighting with his significant other, and she had thrown him out of the house. And that's why he wanted to talk. Incredibly, at one point in the conversation, he actually did something even more weird. We can have that discussion in the chat. And after that initial encounter, Carol somehow became completely enamored with this guy. You may be wondering, what does this have to do with Dawn Lewis? Well, one day, Carol called Bob at work looking for him as usual, and that's how she found out who Bob Martin really was. Dawn had just switched to his secretary and forgotten to tell her to lie to Carol if she called and asked for Bob Martin. The old secretary would just hand the phone over to Dawn. The new secretary this time told Carol the person she was describing was actually named Dawn Lewis. Dawn met Carol and lied to her about his real name because he claimed that he didn't want her to know how much money he had. He wanted her to like him for him. And Carol, even in her diary, had written at that time she didn't know how rich and powerful he actually was. But remember in part 1 of our video on Tiger King, Carol had claimed that Dawn was only worth roughly in the 6 figures. So why would she write that in her diary? Well, think about it this way. When you were 19, $100,000 probably felt like a ton of money. That's definitely how we felt. And especially if you grew up in the way Carol did. Obviously, the older we get, the more we realize that $100,000 really isn't that much money. And that's what happened with Carol. What she had written in her diary was as a 19-year-old. When she got older and started making a lot of money with Don, that's when she realized that he basically just wasn't broke back when she first met him. The fact that Don made up a complete lie with his name and the antics he had in picking her up reveals more of the type of character he was. However, again, we have to remember this is still a he said, she said situation, but so far, logic and facts point to Carol's version. And this isn't the only lie that supposedly Don told. Don's ex-wife and his daughters knew about his notorious womanizing ways. And remember, Carol was with Don while he was still married. And obviously he wouldn't tell his wife about Carol because he wouldn't even tell his daughters about her. Don's daughter Linda had been introduced to Carol when she bumped into her dad randomly in town. Except Carol was introduced as Martha. It wasn't until Linda ran into Carol randomly again at her dad's house when she discovered that the Martha character she had met earlier was actually Carol. However, Dawn wasn't the only person who stretched the truth on the show. Joe Exotic is essentially a pathological liar. His ex-husband John Finley says as much about him in his interview with investigative journalist and author Robert Moore. Joe's ex-internet show producer Rick Kirkham said that he had to put aside a lot of his journalistic integrity to overlook the lies and overall terrible behavior of Joe to his staff and animals. The reason why he did that was because he wanted to cash in on his reality filming of Joe Exotic. Of course, all that footage was burned up. However, a couple things that Netflix did not mention was the fact that Joe was a known scammer. Robert Moore told his Twitter followers that Joe used to tell people he was sick from prostate and bone marrow cancer, and he used that fact to raise money from his fans. As you can tell from Moore's tweet, Joe lied about his actual condition. Joe had much less serious complications that didn't require as much medical treatment. And that wasn't the only scam Joe ran. David Lee Stanton was Joe's first producer for his internet show, Exotic Animal TV. And he had watched Joe run another scam, this time involving animals he would take in. Joe used to take in injured and unwanted animals from time to time. One time, Joe took in a horse with a wounded leg. He asked his internet audience for donations, which poured in order to save the horse. But 2 days later, according to David, Joe Exotic, let's just say, put one right in between the horse's eyes. And no, the donations were not returned. Why didn't Netflix want to put in these allegations? And no, Joe didn't have any sort of dealings with Shaq. Shaq refuted being associated with Joe in any way on his own podcast. But let's get back to Carol and Don. Essentially, Carol and Don got married. To make a really long story short, they started buying up distressed real estate together and built up a sizable real estate portfolio. They were both animal lovers and started buying big cats. This is the extremely short version, and that's what was told on Netflix. However, what Netflix decided to leave out was the why she did a complete 180 on breeding. It's true that Carol did breed tiger cubs at the beginning. Her and Don made a business out of showing their big cats. However, Don and Carol began clashing over their big cat collection, which was over 100 cats by the mid-90s. Don wanted to run a business out of it, but Carol didn't because she started to realize the vicious cycle of breeding big cats. She was an animal lover first through and through. Carol came to the realization that she was just contributing to the problem. Breeding more big cats simply meant more cats that would spend their entire lives in cages. Even Joe Exotic himself came to the realization that breeding tiger cubs for money was a losing proposition. Except his problem was a different problem. He had told Robert Moore how he had made a lot of money with tiger cub petting. The tiger cubs would make the majority of his money. But the problem was that they grew up too fast, and the bigger the tiger cub gets, the more food it has to eat. So the bigger and older the tigers got, the more expensive they became, and the less profitable they were. In order to keep up his cash flow, he had to breed more tiger cubs. So it was a vicious cycle that Joe was caught in. That's when it became more about the money for him and less about the love for the animals. Netflix illustrated expertly the growing rift between Carol and Don. They had painted Don pretty much like a Don Juan when they interviewed his family and friends. They all knew and spoke about Don's womanizing ways. And Carol wasn't any different. Carol knew what she was getting herself into. Remember Don's daughter Linda, whom Don had lied to about Carol's name being Martha? Carol actually had told Robert Moore that she doesn't remember that story at all. She suspected that it was another one of his girlfriends at the time. Netflix had wanted to portray Carol as a woman who was mad at Don for his womanizing. And they also played up their arguments with their differing vision on handling their cats. Then there was the angle of Carol wanting to get rid of Don for the money. Netflix had an incentive to play up the motive for Carol to get rid of Don, because, come on, a story about a lady who possibly could have fed her husband to a tiger definitely pays the bills. However, as we had mentioned in the first video, the money issue with whose property was whose can be easily proven with property records. As far as Don's womanizing goes, it's true that Carol could have been fed up with it, but the flip side could have also been that that's something that Carol just knew she had to deal with. Either way, can be easily argued for. There's still more to Don that Carol wanted people to know about that did not show up on Netflix. Let's first establish the fact that police never named Carol as a suspect. That should give us a good clue right there. The Hillsborough County Police have actually reopened the case since Tiger King came out. Even today, Sheriff Chad Cronster admits that, quote, there has never been sufficient evidence to conclude that any crime was committed. Apparently, people have been calling in with their own theories on what's happened to Don. But Sheriff Cronster also drops more bombshells. Remember this scene?
I mean, there's another theory that one of the buildings they built, there's a septic tank underneath it, that he was put in that.
If we could ever get the law to go in there and dig up that septic tank, I promise you he's underneath that damn thing.
Well, that septic tank wasn't even installed until several years later, as well as the meat grinder. Yep, they actually let Carol address that on the show, but for one reason or another, it wasn't clarified on Netflix that the meat grinder was removed from Big Cat Rescue several weeks before Don's disappearance, according to the police. Another interesting explanation that was left out was for the restraining order Don had filed against Carol. Now, why would the judge deny Don's restraining order? The fact is that most likely he had no proof that Carol was doing anything he accused her of. Her explanation was that Don was looking for a way to stop her from selling his stuff when he was away in Costa Rica. Don apparently would buy cars and trucks or other equipment at auctions. He had wanted to resell them, except he would rarely sell anything. Essentially, he became a hoarder and he would dump a lot of junk onto where Big Cat Rescue sits now. So what would Carol do? Well, apparently she would haul off the property as much of the junk as she could, and Don found out she was doing this. He tried calling the police to get them to stop her, but they told him he needed a restraining order. According to Carol, she doesn't know why Don made up the story that she was threatening him. That's a good point. Why couldn't he just tell the police that she was hauling off his property, even if it was junk? Now, it's true, the whole disappearance clause is suspicious, but Carol has another explanation for this as well that the Netflix producers decided to leave out. Apparently going to Costa Rica and disappearing was a thing her and Don had worried about. Their Costa Rican attorney, Roger Peterson, had told them that the people Don was loaning money to down in Costa Rica were basically like the mob. So that's why they had the word disappearance included as something that would give Carol the power of attorney. But to make things a bit more mysterious, they left it out when it could have been easily explained. It probably actually would have worked against Carol if they had included this in the story, but that's just our opinion. Because the whole Costa Rican mob angle sounds a little bit far-fetched and it just makes her sound a bit crazy. What actually happened? To be honest, we have no clue. Maybe Don really did have Alzheimer's and he just went off the deep end one day. Maybe he really did have bad relations with someone down in Costa Rica. Any crazy theory has the same amount of weight here. We don't think he actually disappeared on his own willingly somewhere. Unless he had buried a ton of money and dug it up and left, it just doesn't make sense. Carol never said a bunch of money went missing. We also don't think Carol did it. The motive for Carol to get rid of her husband in a sinister way just isn't there. If what she says is actually true for the property, she could just easily get a divorce from Don and get half of her share. One thing to think about is that her first husband treated her much worse, and he's still alive. And then here's the last fact. Police have absolutely nothing on Carol Baskin. Watch this next video to find out about the truth about the escape from Alcatraz.